One of the spiritual writers that people most frequently recommend I check out is a person named Richard Rohr. And when they recommend that I check out Richard Rohr, they do it with an unbridled enthusiasm, as if he has discovered some profound new spiritual insight that nobody else has seen before. If you don't know who Richard Rohr is, he is very well known in spiritual circles. He's been interviewed by Oprah twice. And he's a Franciscan priest who believes in what he calls the universal Christ. That's actually a title of a book of his. I think it's the most popular of his books. And in that understanding of the universal Christ, Richard Rohr says that he believes the ultimate purpose of it all, of existence, of life, of why we're here, is to fall in love with the divine under whatever name. And that's why he encourages people to go deep into their own tradition, their own belief system, because he believes as they go deeper into their own tradition, they will encounter this universal Christ. He's a self-described panentheist. Panentheism is the belief that God is in all things, but God also transcends all things. So that's why Richard Rohr encourages people to go more deeply into their own tradition, because as they do, they will encounter the universal Christ, and encountering the universal Christ, fall in love with him, fall in love with the divine, which is the ultimate point of existence. When people encourage me to read Richard Rohr, and I have, I've watched one of his interviews with Oprah Winfrey, and I've listened to some of his talks, watched them actually on YouTube. When people encourage me to check Richard Rohr out, I don't need to go much further than what I already have, because I really know what he's all about. I know what he teaches, not only because in the things that I have heard of him, he's articulated them, he's kind of comprehensively gone through all that he believes, what his essential teaching is, but more importantly, because I've encountered Richard Rohr before in a totally different person. In the 1980s, in another priest, a Dominican priest named Matthew Fox, especially in a book he wrote called Original Blessing. I was so enamored with that book, with Matthew Fox, that I would encourage people to read his book and to check out Matthew Fox the way people encourage me to check out Richard Rohr. In fact, I would encourage them with the same enthusiasm as if Matthew Fox had discovered some profound new spiritual insight that nobody else had seen before. Matthew Fox was essentially saying the same thing that Richard Rohr is now, although he was using different terms, at least slightly different terms. So instead of the universal Christ, Matthew Fox called it the cosmic Christ. Instead of talking about people going deeper into their own tradition, Matthew Fox had this thing called creation spirituality. That was kind of like his whole paradigm, his whole platform, wherein he said that we all share the same transcendent creator. And so the deeper we go into our own traditions, our own belief systems, the more we will encounter him there. It was in Matthew Fox that I first heard the term panentheism. In fact, I thought that Matthew Fox invented the term. Apparently he didn't. And that whole idea that the deeper you go into your own tradition, your own belief system, the more you will encounter the transcendent, the universal Christ. So I love what Richard Rohr is presenting. I'm very drawn to his ideas, because I was very drawn. In fact, I was totally taken in by what Matthew Fox was proposing, very similar ideas back in the 1980s. But as I continued to dig deeper, as I continued to explore further, what I came to find is that Matthew Fox's ideas, as attractive as they were to me, were logically incoherent. They just fell apart. And so when I hear somebody like Richard Rohr, people recommending him to me all the time, what I want to ask him is what I would have asked Matthew Fox back 40 years ago, is how do you know? How do you know that this new insight that you're proposing, which in many cases isn't really all that new, it's somebody else has already thought of it, but how do you know that it's true? Especially in light of all the other truth claims that are out there, especially of the major world religions, which have been around for thousands of years, millennia, and have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of adherents. How do you know that your truth claim is superior to theirs? Oftentimes that gets presented, Richard Rohr's teaching like his gets presented as if it's more enlightened, more evolved, if it's more tolerant and accepting and loving and compassionate and sophisticated. And if you're like me, as somebody who believes in a God of love, all those things are very, very attractive to you. So that's why I'm very drawn to people like Matthew Fox and Richard Rohr. But how do they know? The major world religions draw on things like revelation, claiming that God has revealed something to them. They draw on scriptural traditions which have been revealed, and a very solid interpretation of them, a tradition of interpretation to understand what they're actually saying, what they believe God is actually revealing. They draw on intellectual traditions, an accumulated wisdom through the ages that is based on a rationality that is deep and rich, and which they understand as to be the most logically coherent way of understanding all things, of making sense of reality. So how is it that somebody can come along like a Matthew Fox, Richard Rohr, there are many others, and claim something very different, claim a new or deeper spiritual insight into all things? How do they know? Perhaps they have had a new revelation, but they don't even claim to. Richard Rohr, nor Matthew Fox, nor most of the others don't claim to have some kind of revelation from God, let alone bother to try to authenticate that the way the major religious traditions do. Whatever you make of the way they authenticate it, you may not believe that those religious traditions are true, but at least they claim revelation and they claim to authenticate it. People like Richard Rohr don't. Maybe it's because Richard Rohr has stumbled upon a superior exegesis. Maybe he has an understanding of Scripture that everybody's missed before. He sees something in it that for 2,000 years people have missed in the Bible. But the best Scripture scholarship, modern Scripture scholarship, flies in the face of a lot of what Richard Rohr is saying. It understands Scripture. It says the best interpretation of Scripture is much different than what Richard Rohr or Matthew Fox or many others do with Scripture when they use it in their teachings. So it can't be that. It's not revelation. It's not Scripture. Maybe it's superior reasoning. Maybe they have an airtight logic. And in fact, that is what it seems to me. They never say it explicitly, but what it seems to me Richard Rohr, people like Richard Rohr and Matthew Fox are relying on, that when we see what they're saying, it will resonate in a way that says, this is what's most true. This is what's most enlightened. This is the most enlightened view, the most evolved view. This is self-evident. This is obvious. This is clearly what things are all about. But the only problem with that is when you do try to think deeply about the things that they're saying, it all falls apart. Like my experience with Matthew Fox, the same thing holds true with Richard Rohr and many others, that the system that they present, the worldview that they present, it turns out to be logically incoherent. I only have time to give one example, but this is central to Richard Rohr's platform as well as Matthew Fox's. It's the idea that we're all going to end up in the same place, that we're all destined to fall in love with the divine. That's kind of automatic. It's a given. All humanity will end up with the divine for all eternity. That's the point of existence. Sounds great. And again, as somebody who believes in a God of love, I love this idea. Traditionally, although they don't use the term, Rohr and Matthew Fox generally don't use the term. Traditionally, this has been known as universalism, that all people will be saved. All people are destined to heaven, to be with God for all eternity. But when you stop and think about it for a second, it all falls apart. It is logically incoherent. Just one quick example. If universalism is true, if what Richard Rohr is proposing, that we all are destined to the same reality, the same place in a sense, the same falling in love with the divine, then it means that both Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler, though on totally different, in fact, arguably opposite, complete opposite trajectories in this life, are destined to the same ultimate reality. That right now, Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa are both in the loving presence of God, have both fallen in love with the divine. And that would mean that the lives they lived are somehow equivalent, because they're ending up in the same ultimate reality, that they're on a spiritual path that brings them to the same place. And that means that whether you live like a Mother Teresa or an Adolf Hitler, it doesn't really matter, because you're going to end up in the same place. And that ultimately means that nothing matters. Nothing we believe or do really matters, because it's automatic that we will fall in love with the divine. And that is logically incoherent. Even as William P. Young, you may recognize that name because he's the writer of The Shack, the wildly popular book called The Shack, who happens to be a friend of Richard Rohr. He's critiqued Richard Rohr on this. He says that if what Richard Rohr believes is true, this universalism, then it means that nothing matters. In fact, what is the whole point of this earthly life if it's just automatic that we're going to fall in love with the divine? Just take a moment to reflect on that, to think about that. What divine entity, what God would put us here on this earth with all the incomprehensible suffering we experience, with all the evil we encounter, if it's just automatic that we're going to be with him for all eternity? We're going to fall in love with this universal Christ. Why wouldn't he, from the start, place us, create us in his presence? Unless this life is necessary, absolutely necessary, to determine our eternal destiny, to give us the freedom, the separation from God, what one philosopher calls the epistemic distance, where we aren't in the overwhelming presence of God and have no choice, but actually there's ambiguity built into reality where we experience both the presence and absence of God, and can make a choice and can ultimately determine our destiny. Unless that's the point, it's the only point that really is of a magnitude that can justify the kind of suffering that we encounter on earth. Unless that's the point, then why would God put us through this earthly life? It's actually cruel for him to do it if we're all going to end up automatically in the same place. Don't get me wrong. I love what Richard Rohr is proposing. I want it to be true. Just like I was enamored with Matthew Fox, and for a time of my life, I actually believed it was all true. But I really want it to be true. It sounds so good. It does sound more enlightened, more evolved. But when you think about it, when you just take some time to think through it deeply, you realize that it's logically incoherent. It doesn't hold together. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to pick on Richard Rohr, because there are plenty of other spiritual gurus out there, both contemporary people like Marianne Williamson or the late Wayne Dyer, or of previous generations like Matthew Fox and even before him, who were proposing similar ideas. So I'm not picking on him. In fact, I love what he says about the whole point, and I totally agree with him. The whole point of this life is to fall in love with the divine. So I'm not picking on him. I actually really like a lot of what he's saying. I just think that he's wrong, because if the whole point of falling in love, the whole point of life is falling in love with the divine, you can't fall in love unless you freely choose to. Love is not love unless it's freely chosen. That's the whole point of this earthly life, to give us free will, to give us the epistemic distance from God, to be able to determine our eternal destiny, to decide whether we freely would choose to fall in love with God or not. Because if it's not freely chosen, it's not love. And in order to fall in love with somebody, you have to know them personally, intimately. That's why it's so thrilling when you're in love with somebody, that when you find out something new about them, it gives you such a thrill. That's the ecstasy of love. The more you come to know about them, the more deeply you fall in love with them. To fall in love with the divine, we have to know God personally, intimately, deeply. That's the whole point of Jesus. Jesus has come to reveal God to us in person so that we can fall in love with the divine. Without him, we can't fall in love with the divine, because we don't know the divine personally, intimately, deeply. That's the whole point of Jesus. And so if Richard Rohr is right, if the whole point is to fall in love with the divine, I totally agree with him on that, then the thing that is most self-evident is that the religion which claims to have God revealed in person has the best claim to be the truth, is the best candidate to be the truth, because it's the only way that human beings could fall in love with the divine. So what do you think of Richard Rohr? I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave them there. I look forward to hearing from you.